All right, everybody, welcome back. Today I'm going to take you through the Develop module in Lightroom Classic. And so here is where you're going to actually edit your photographs. So we're going to start here in the Develop module. And if you're in Library or some other module, just go ahead and click over. Simple as that. But we're going to start here. And what's nice about the Develop module is it actually gives you access to all your collections here on the left-hand side. So you can see these are the collections that we started last time. We have assignment number 1 collection set, and then within here we have 2 collections, right? We have this image 1, or this folder 1, collection 1 with 1 image, and then we have this other folder with 2 images. Okay, and so you can access your images here when you're going to choose which one to work on. Which is very convenient. So where I want to take you now is actually over to this right-hand side, and this is where the majority of the developing work is going to happen, okay? And I'm not going to go over every single one of these tabs because I think for the purposes of the beginning of the class, you're really going to only be working in basic and maybe tone curve, maybe color eventually. But for the most part, we're going to stay in basic and use all the tools that are available here, okay? And for your first assignment, I actually am asking you to work in black and white. So I'll go over color in another video, but I want you to pay attention to black and white images just because I think when you're first learning about photography and editing photographs, it's easier to stay in black and white just because you're eliminating another element within the image. And color, you can do a lot of things. It's a great tool. But if you don't have the basics down of image editing, color, I think, can complicate things. So we're going to start in black and white. Okay. So what you can do is you can open an image you want to work on. We're going to work on this image to start with. And if you look over here on this right-hand side of your Lightroom window, you have the histogram up here at the top, and I'll do another video that deals specifically with histogram. But what you need to know for this purposes is that this kind of corresponds with your exposure of your image, which you're consulting your light meter for. And you can see here as I hover over each of these areas of the histogram, it goes from all the way on the left-hand side, it goes from your blacks. If you shift in a little bit, it has shadows. Then you have this exposure thing here, and these are corresponding with different areas of your basic tools. Then you have highlights, and then you have whites. But like I said, we're not going to be working in color. We're going to be working in black and white. So if you go down here to this treatment area, you'll see that right now we have color highlighted. Okay, so this is the file read your image in color. We're simply going to click over here to black and white, and it's going to shift the image over to a black and white image. Okay, so now you'll see up back at the histogram, we still have the blacks, we still have the shadows, we still have the exposure, highlights, and the whites. Okay, and so these are kind of two extremes of your exposure, right? And you'll see how it shifts as we kind of edit this photograph. So I'm not going to do a full edit on this thing. I'm just going to show you how the sliders here work and what's important and what you should be looking for. Okay. So like I said, treatment, we're going to do black and white. This profile here, you can leave this as monochrome. If you click on this, it has other preset Adobe profiles. We're working in black and white for now, so just use this monochrome one. White balance is this little dropper here. I'll talk about white balance in another video, but we're not going to be using it for this one. And then here you have this as shot white balance. Again, just leave that there. We're not going to touch that. You also have temperature and tint, and this, I think if you were to move these, it would change the image slightly in black and white. But again, we're not going to be using these until we talk about color, and I'll have a whole video about white balance later on. down here is where you're going to be doing most of your work, okay? So now here you start to see some familiar terminologies. We have exposure, we have contrast, we have highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. We're not going to be dealing with texture and dehaze and clarity. I really want you to focus here for the beginning of the course, and maybe we'll jump into these other ones at another time. Okay, but here is you can see we're going to start to make some adjustments. Okay, so right away with exposure, this functions a lot like your aperture and your shutter speed in your camera. If we were to shift this back and forth, you'll see that if we pull it to the negative, meaning we're giving less exposure, this mocks, stopping your lens down or making your shutter speed faster. It's going to darken the image up. Okay, so this is the extreme here. I pulled it down. It started at 0, and I'm at 2.4, negative 2.4. And you can think of these numbers here as stops, right? So if I were to go back to 0 and then pull this down to negative 1, right? That would be one stop less light that is being given to this image, right? If I were to pull this down again, all the way here, this is like, 2 stops. Okay, but I think it's pretty self-explanatory. When you pull the number down, it's going to make it darker. When you then pull the number up for exposure, it's going to brighten the image up. Okay, so don't get confused if the idea of stops don't line up. Just know that for your purposes, when you pull something down for exposure, it gets darker. When you pull it up, it gets lighter. Okay. So exposure is going to deal with how light or how dark the image is. And you also notice, if you take a look up at the histogram when I pull this, okay, so it changes, right? So if I were to pull it towards minus, all the information shifts over to the left-hand side, which is where your dark areas are. Conversely, if I were to pull it the other way, all the information shifts over to the right-hand side, which is where your lights are, okay? So the histogram is good in this sense because it allows you to check your exposure in camera. So you'll notice when we look at my histogram here, you can kind of know that I don't have anything that's underexposed. I don't have a lot of blacks in this image, okay, because this is where the blacks are. If I come over here to the whites, I don't have a lot of whites here, okay. I do have a lot of highlights because of the sky, so you can tell by how the histogram kind of pops up. I don't have a lot of shadows, and you can see that by this histogram being low here. Okay, so the first thing you kind of want to do is make sure your exposure is correct. You can make some adjustments with the exposure slider here in Lightroom, but also know that you have to expose well in the camera, right? Because if you don't expose well in the camera, you're not going to get all the information, meaning you're not going to get all the blacks that are present in your image, or maybe any of the whites that are in your image, okay? So exposure is really critical. You have a little bit of latitude here in Lightroom, but you need to expose well in camera. Okay, that's exposure. Contrast is going to be another important one at your control. And contrast has to deal with the relationship between the lights and the blacks. Okay, so again, if I were to pull this to the left, meaning I'm lowering the contrast, you can see that the image is going to turn really gray and a little muddy. Okay, so I'm all the way at the extreme of this contrast, all the way down. We're losing our bright whites. Our blacks are still there, but it overall has this kind of gray feeling to it. If I were to go and pull it to the opposite direction and really pump up the contrast, you can see that our blacks are getting a lot blacker, our highlights get a lot lighter, and the transition from white to black is a lot more stark, okay? So when you're editing your photographs, you want to kind of find what works for your image, okay? I shouldn't say that there's a right answer, but there's definitely images that work better with less contrast versus images that work better with more contrast. And they both have a different feel to them. So you're going to have to figure out what image requires what contrast, okay? Then you have your highlights here. So these sliders, these 4, they kind of fine-tune different areas of your image, okay? So if you notice, if I pull the highlight slider back and forth, I'm only affecting the highlight areas, okay? So if I pull it up here you'll see that the clouds are getting a bit more white. Okay. If I were to pull it down, everything would get a little more muddy, just like when we pull down our contrast. Okay. Shadows is going to be the areas that are just above your blacks. Okay, so shadow areas are probably stuff like in here, these shipping containers, maybe this over here, maybe this area underneath the light here. If I were to pull the shadows down, we will see that those areas are going to get darker. Okay, so it's not literally defined as a shadow, but we're talking more about like the lower value areas of your image. Okay, if I were to pull it up, it would open up the shadows, so these areas become a lot lighter. Okay, here I'm just going to pull it back and forth a little bit. The whites are obviously the lightest areas of the image. Okay, so if I were to hover over my histogram here thing again, you can see that the white areas, it's not that much actually. There might be some areas in here that are just like pure white. Actually, if I just pull this down, maybe we'll see that being changed. Okay, so it's kind of overall, but that's like the whitest white area. This image shot in camera is, there's a lot of highlight areas, so the whites are going to be affected quite broadly. Okay, and then this last one here, the blacks, these are going to be these areas here that are the darkest values in your photograph. And if I'm using terminology that is confusing to you, what I'll probably do is refer you to a terminology handout that I'm going to give to you folks. Okay. So here the blacks are going really dark, and here I'm pulling them up. Everything's kind of lightening up. Okay. So to give you kind of a sense of what I would do to this image, I like that the clouds have this like a lot of this movement. There's these strong verticals here. So probably what I would do is looking at my histogram here, just to give you a sense of how I might edit this. The exposure I think is pretty good, so I would leave that there for now. I think I want a little more contrast because I want those clouds to kind of pop a little more. So I'm going to pull the contrast up a little bit. Okay. The highlights, let's kind of play around, see what happens. If you're not sure, you can move these sliders back and forth to kind of see what feels right to you. I don't want to pull them that much. Maybe I'll just leave it at 0 right now. I'll pull the shadows down just because I want a little bit more contrast in the image. Okay. The whites, maybe we'll bump those up just a bit, just to give a little bit more action in the sky. The blacks maybe we'll pull down just a little bit as well. Okay. So this is far from done, but I'm just kind of giving you an example of like how you can change the image with this basic tab here. And then if we really want to fine tune things, we can go into the tone curve down here. Okay. So again, you'll see some areas that are familiar to you: highlights, lights, darks, and shadows. These sliders here you can move around and do some more fine tuning. Okay, so you'll look up at the histogram. I'm affecting the highlights here, making them a lot brighter. The lights is more towards the midtones. Okay, the darks, moving them a little bit, and then my shadows finally. Okay, something like that. So again, this is far from a finished image, and I'll probably take you through like a whole image later on, but I wanted to just expose you to these basic tools that you have at your disposal for your photo editing purposes. Okay, so with that, I'm going to end this video here, and I'll see you in the next one.